asked me what to do. I said, seize the ship. And so we did. We took the ship into custody and we put a $5 million bond on it. Like, you know, it's a bail bond. You can't move the ship. The ship is now ours. And we got into the damage control and finding out, you know, what the damage really was, et cetera, et cetera. So that was a really wild night. I had not planned to be Charlie Royer, the bridge builder, at that early point in my mayoralty. At some point, we would build the West Seattle Bridge, but I didn't plan for it to start that soon.
So things kicked into action, as we all know, and many of you have alluded to it. There's some good story about what happened back in Washington, D.C., and let's go to you two to elucidate that end of the thing. And Tom, with Jeanette, you might have something to throw in. Jack, too. Feel free to pass the mic back and forth, but this is, where is the money going to come from?
I think Jerry is at the same meeting where we go to the Special Bridge Replacement Fund office in the Department of Transportation, which is this 2 rooms and a guy. That's it. And so we have our Polaroids. We have the technology of that age is really working well. We have these 12 Polaroids that show the damage to the bridge and stuck up, and I lay those Polaroids on this guy. Here, this thing. It's, God, what a hell of a mess. And then he says, get a look at this. And he pulls out a set of Polaroids about a bridge accident that had just occurred in Virginia, where a military ship had run into a bridge and destroyed a section of the bridge. And then I say, gosh, that's terrible. And then he says, get a load of this one, and here is something in New Orleans. And so at that time I realized that I lived in a very big country, really big. So it was very, very competitive there with these other accidents in this relatively tiny bit of money. I mean, the total cost for the bridge, I think we understood then, was maybe about $150 to $180 million or something like that. And here's Special Bridge Replacement, and we're a city street. We don't exist in the federal landscape. We're a city street. And so it was distressing, to say the least. But we then had an even more distressing meeting, and I'll let Jerry tell you that one. The one with the New Jersey guy.
Yeah, well, I don't think I was actually in that one, but I will tell you what was going on. This should have been a lot easier than it was, because at the time, Brock Adams was the Secretary of Transportation. And we had thought that any bureaucratic obstacles to this allocation would have been addressed from the Secretary's office. Unfortunately, much to our irritation, actually, the Secretary was actually hoping that Senator Magnuson would not seek re-election so he could run. And so he was a little bit concerned that Senator Magnuson, if he did this, would get credit for it, and that would embolden him to continue with his plan to seek re-election. Of course, the senator had decided to do that already, and it was a ridiculous idea in the first place. But we did have a lot of behind-the-scenes back and forthing on this, and it is not well known that occurred. But our approach to these problems was always to try to get the bureaucracy to do the right thing on its own, without intervention, without legislative intervention. And of course there was behind the scenes convincing to do And I'm sure that other senators and representatives were promoting their projects with that office. But at the end of the day, if the bureaucracy was recalcitrant and we ran out of patience, or we had a legislative strategy ready to go, which of course we did in this case, we were just going to legislatively take the money. So the conversation occurred, and I don't think it actually took place directly with Brock. He had a deputy who was Alan, what was his name?
He wasn't in the room.
He wasn't there, but I think maybe I had the conversation with the deputy later at some point, maybe you weren't in that, where we basically explained that we could do it the easy way, they could do it, or we could do it the hard way, and we would legislate. And ultimately, they made the right decision.
And the budget had left the Senate. Remember, it'd been voted on. All of the appropriation power of the Senate was now used up, and it was over at the House. So in order to change the budget,
For the appropriation.
in order to change the appropriation, you had to have unanimous consent of the House, because that's where the appropriation is now.
Have we gone to conference on that? It was a conference that we
So anyway, there's this meeting, and we then realize that we have to go to this representative from New Jersey, who was the dude in transportation in the House.
The chair of the transportation
Yeah.
subcommittee appropriations.
So he says, as we're kind of going along here, state of Washington, big accident, blah, blah, blah. He says, is this in any way going to help Brock Adams? And of course, there's not a closed mouth in our group. Is this in any way going to help Brock Adams? And the air just went out of the room. A bunch of cowards, started to hide under the table. But Norm Dix said clearly, without any fear at all, no, no, get out of here. No help whatsoever. And we got unanimous consent.
And Norm,
Kennedy was in Seattle speaking at the Olympic Hotel. They did a fundraiser, and Kennedy had a very sweet tribute to Magnuson, which was the senator has all of a sudden it becomes clear that the senator has a little amendment that they want to add, and the senator goes down and says this is nothing, and then Grand Coulee Dam is built.
Just to try to move this along, let's go. We're going to get into the construction phase, but first, before construction, you need to wrap up the money, and it wasn't all from the federal government. And we had an editorial cartoon in the West Seattle Herald of Jeanette being Superwoman, running circles even around the mayor to try to get more money from a variety of agencies. Tom and Jack, can you talk about how that happened?
She was just really great at organizing support for something like this. She kept circling back to people who could make decisions or put pressure on the right people to make decisions. I think that one of the things that Jack mentioned that is so critical to remember, this cooperation with the port was really critical. Jeanette loved the port commissioners because some of them were blue collar like Jack. They were forceful, direct people who knew what you had to do to have a successful port and a successful city. And no fooling around about it. It had to be built. So it was her no-nonsense approach, and that was the style that she liked in other people as well, that really made it possible. I do, though, I have heard someone who is closely involved in this reminded me, and Charlie, you may correct the record if this is wrong, that you did not support full funding for this. I think that she had to go to Olympia to get some funding, and you were perhaps working against it or were neutral. So correct that if not, because that rumor is out there that you were a little bit cool to that, or to the full funding for the high-level bridge.
Well, that was not I was not opposed to full funding for the High Level Bridge. I was opposed to promising it if we couldn't get it. And only at the point where Warren Magnuson, it may be a city street, but it's in the city that Warren Magnuson represented in the Senate. And that man had incredible friends. We got all the bridge replacement money in the country at one point. But I'm not taking anything away from Jeanette. She did a great job, and she deserves the credit for working very hard with all of these different sources. But actually, it was more of a team effort. I mean, we had a really good group of people working even in the mayor's office, and we're all brand new. Remember, we were doing this stuff with 6 months experience under our belt. And I had a very steep learning curve. I wasn't a City Hall veteran by any stretch. So, and the City Council was very cool to me. They saw me as a new guy, and I had run against 4 of them. So the political situation was a little tough, but I definitely wanted a bridge, and I wanted a better one than we ultimately got. We ended up with a bridge that we could get, and one that worked. Same thing happened with another big project that was very controversial in the city, the Westlake project. I wanted a beautiful art museum with some retail connected to it at Westlake. It would have been beautiful with some park, etc. We ended up with an office building and a retail piece that's not very attractive. Sometimes in politics you end up with what you can afford. And now that I'm no longer at City Hall but working on the waterfront, I don't want that to happen there. These projects get dumbed down over time because you can't get the money together, or you don't have the skill really to make the calls that will get you through these troubles of lack of funding, lack of imagination, lack of understanding the future, all these things that happen to you on a big project. So I'd rather have a couple of calls back, including one on the West Seattle Bridge, but also at Westlake. And that just not the way it works. But we did work as a team. I remember meetings with Jeanette in my office where more than one drink was passed around after work. Jeanette did like her bourbon, by the way. And so we worked together and we made something happen ultimately.
I just want to say, I'm sorry, I have to go. We have out-of-town guests, so I need to leave, and my apologies for that. But Phyllis Lamphere is not here, as you heard, because she's doing something in connection with Proposition 1. And I would be remiss, and she would be cross with me, if I didn't say we both hope that you will see your way clear to voting yes on Proposition 1 in August. Thank you.
Jerry, thank you for being here tonight. And I know it's partly our fault, my fault, for the delay here in the sound system, but don't leave home without one, right? We're going to get to the construction, but first, Terry, I want to ask you, okay, the ship has hit the span, the money is coming in. West Seattle is not one monolithic place. What were West Seattle residents thinking at the prospect of a high bridge? I mean, there's some good, but there's some fear, right?
Yeah, it wasn't a unanimous approval of the bridge, and there were a lot of elements. I think even some people at Alki, especially Beach Drive, there were some people who wanted to kind of continue to revel in their isolation from the city, is sort of the way I put it. And I think most of us kind of just fear of how West Seattle might change. When I first came to the Northwest from the Midwest, and I first came to Seattle, I thought West Seattle is the place that's most like where I came from in the Midwest of all the neighborhoods in Seattle. And for a long time, I think there was that attitude here that even though we're separate, we're a little isolated, we're a little different, we are also rather independent. We have a great, beautiful place to live in West Seattle, and we don't want to see obviously some business interests, some real estate interests, people like that. We're hoping for better transportation connection for development purposes in West Seattle. And I think there was some opposition to that. I will say in defense of former Mayor Royer that he was in a tough spot when he came into office, and having West Seattle crabbing at not just him but previous administrations about the lack of adequate transportation to West Seattle. And when there was no money available, what are you going to do? Here's a headline: Royer, I think we got snowed. That was his quote, and what he was really trying to say was that there have been too many bad promises made to West Seattleites over the years. He did take a position, kind of an honest one, I thought, and West Seattle did support you, Charlie, if you remember that. West Seattle Herald did. And against Paul Schell, for which I later worked at the Port of Seattle for many years, and I took flack for that about every day from Paul Schell when he was the commissioner there. But he was in a tough spot, and after the money became available, in other words, after the ship hit the span, and Senator Magnuson, with Bob's help and lots of other people, were able to activate the Emergency Bridge Fund, then the situation changed. Then it was much more politically palatable to go after the big high-level bridge, even though it wasn't a perfect solution. It wasn't the one that maybe Charlie envisioned. It was much more politically palatable to do that, and it was also safer to make some sort of commitment to the voters, both in West Seattle and the rest of the city. And I just wanted to say, when they tore down the old bridge, a number of us who were involved in the whole episode over the years, when they tore it down, they cut up pieces of the metal and the rivets. They handed out these, which are two of the rivets in the old plate, steel plate from the West Seattle Bridge, and it's been either in my office or in my home office for 34 years now when they did it, and it was, it was a big achievement. 1924 to 1980 was the old bridge.
Thank you, Terry. Now, let's get into construction, and I want the rest of you to be thinking ahead. I think the next thing we'll talk about is what happened to the captain. But construction, this bridge, there is some beauty to the bridge. It's not like you said, a Golden Gate, but it took a lot of engineering, and I spent hours and hours in meetings with Bruce Wassell, who not only you and Tom had to be on the inside planning this bridge, but you had to deal with the public about it in meeting after meeting after meeting. Can you give us the basics of why the bridge is designed the way it is?
I got a call last night from Bruce. Says, Tom, I don't want to talk too much. Can you take care of it? Now, that's almost brought me back to 1978 or 79. It's like, Tom, make this problem go away, please. And you've heard all the turmoil that was hitting this man from the political side. I was isolated from all of that by this guy. It was a work of genius, really it was. He's a very modest man, but he doesn't get the credit that he deserves. I didn't hear anything about what was going on politically, except the first thing we signed up for was figure out how many movable bridges we could put across there, where and why, and so on. We took 2 months to come up with a report, and it had 8 different alternatives. It used the old bridges and new foundations, used new bridges and new foundations. We knew that they wanted to have a wider channel and a deeper channel, 50 feet wider and 20 feet deeper. We knew that if we did a high-level bridge, it was going to have to be about 160 feet high. We had to go to the Coast Guard and the Pilots Association and say, how about 140? Wouldn't that work fine? Well, that's so much better than what they had. But this guy and I went to a whole lot of Coast Guard meetings and Pilots Association meetings, adjusting all of these things. And it was wonderful to work with him and be isolated from what happened at the other end of the table here. Not that they didn't do some marvelous things, they absolutely did. But from my standpoint, we turned out a report in a couple of months, but even before that report was done, He came to me and he says, Tom, we want to have you finish the report so we can pay you for it, but would you shift your main team onto some different alternatives? Because I think it looks like it might be a high-level bridge. So I did. I said, okay, this is the editorial staff. You go polish up this report. Okay, guys, let's gather around and talk about high-level bridges. Now, in 3 weeks time from him telling me that, we had a meeting. And at that meeting, our team, and it wasn't a very big team, it was maybe 10 or 15 of us, had put together 19 different alternatives to get across the bridge. I don't really want to comment much about the bridge design that was done earlier than we started. I'll give you a couple of insights though. The city employees were so aware of avoiding graft that when we'd hold a meeting with them and we'd serve them coffee, when we went to clean up, under each cup was a dime. They weren't going to take any payola, even a free cup of coffee. Okay, so the word had gotten down from somebody up above, we're going to be clean Gene about this, and they were, and it was wonderful. I think I would characterize the whole experience with one word: integrity. I tried very hard not to promise what I could not produce, what our team could not produce. I could trust this man totally. If he says, I'm going to get this done, it would happen. And what I told him would get done, it will happen. That's integrity. And we did that for 4 years, 5 years. We turned out, well, I have a bookshelf that has about 24 inches worth of 8.5 by 11 reports that we did during a 2-year period. I have a stack of drawings, literally that high, laid out flat, that we did in about 2 years. The bridge design group that I had working on it had some utterly brilliant people on it. Tom Kane, my boss and the principal in charge of the project, provided every staff need that we needed. He was wonderful. He brought in John Clark, who is probably the best bridge engineer the state of Washington has ever produced. An absolutely brilliant man. And he did most of the preliminary design work, and then he turned right around and did the final design work, and it always worked out. We rewrote the design criteria from regular bridge design criteria. We wrote a design criteria for seismic design that was 20 years ahead of its time. 20 years after that bridge was built, it became the design standard for the nation. And that was John Clark. I was just surrounded by wonderful people. During construction, Bob Curry, a wonderful construction man. Again, absolute integrity. He was out there on the job site, and I got a call from him one day. Tom, it looks like we've got a bad bunch of concrete in the high-level bridge about a quarter of the way out. What do you mean? Somehow or another, it doesn't have enough cement in it. Ooh, that's not good. What are we going to have to do? We're going to have to take that segment down with shovels and jackhammers and throw it away, redo it from scratch, and build it all over again. It's going to delay the job 2 weeks. Now those are tough calls. I said, okay, Bob, I'll give Bruce a call, let him know, I'll get back to you. Bruce says, do what you think is best. Call Bob back, says, start tearing it down. Tough calls, tough calls. But if you delay, it's just more delay.